Welcome to another edition of Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. My name is Aljamal Bindin. I am the chair of the board, and what we're going to have is kind of an unusual program today because we're going to talk about the Nebraska Equal Opportunity Commission and the Omaha Human Rights and Relations Department, should they be abolished. And we're also going to enter into hopefully some conversations and questions with some of the peers about some of the challenges that we as African Americans and other folks experience with those two functionary departments that are not that effective. The other thing I want to say starting off is that we do have freedom of speech, and I know there's some people who suffer from white fragility, nervousness, and don't want to enter into certain conversations. We talk about racial issues as indicated by the present administration, both nationally, locally, as well as statewide. In terms of, I've heard from reliable sources, they have banned people from talking about race issues because they don't want to talk about the historical oppressions of people of color, and particularly African Americans, 400 years of oppression in this country. And one of the things I want to say up front is I've invited both directors of both the Human Relations Department and EOC to sit on my show. I've written both of them, I think, a few, particularly the Human Relations Department, numerous times, have not returned phone calls, have not responded to correspondence in an adequate manner. And I'm talking about the director of the Human Relations Department, who really is, I'm not sure she's qualified to be in that job in terms of some of the things that she's put forward in terms of communicating with our community. For example, Caitlin and I raised the issue of their annual report some years ago when she got the job, and she sent me back a one page with about 3 paragraphs. And I'm saying, are you serious? I come from a community and a school of thought where when you give an annual report, it usually has a number of pages. And what she sent me was like a couple of places she spoke and a couple of people she talked to. But at the end of the day, it did not address many of the issues that I raised. The other issue that I raised with her is that how can you have engagement in our community when you have nobody of color, particularly African Americans, in leadership positions pushing the envelope? We do have a director of chief diversity officer, Keith Station, no impingement on his personality, but again, since his tenure, I've not seen one sheet of paper dealing with the progressive engagement and hiring and participation of people of color inside the city of Omaha. Again, we as people of color, particularly African Americans, pay our fair share of taxes thanks to the internal Department of Internal Revenue, whether it's about state or the federal, and yet we don't see the return on our dollar looking at city, county, and state government, and particularly on the national level. But Caitlin Dejan, I think I'm not pronouncing her last name well. We've talked one time when she first got the job. She said to me, and I never forgot how she said it. She says, "This state of Nebraska does not support affirmative action." And the way she said it was kind of a pejorative, negative way. She put it like, why are you putting pressure on me when you as a state don't support that? I understand she'd come from San Francisco. She may have Nebraska roots, but she doesn't have roots in the community of the press or community of dealing with many of the racial incidents that we've dealt with in Nebraska. So I question her credibility to be in that department and also provide the leadership when she doesn't return phone calls or respond to correspondence. Someone like me who writes letters constantly, drop a note card, email. I have documentation of these things I've done for over 30, 40 years. But again, when you write to these public functionaries and they don't respond, why should they be employed using tax dollars and they don't know how to at least send a letter, say acknowledgement of your letter or your correspondence? I disagree with you. I'm not going to do anything. But to ignore someone is a slight is a affront to that person's role of being involved in advocacy. Going back to Paula Gardner, I talked to her extensively for probably about 30 minutes, and she seemed like she was open. And one of the things she said to me is that she wanted me to have both her colleague, the Human Rights Department, and her do it together at the same time. I called both individuals, no response. We had set a date that we could probably do it. Again, I even said to Paula, why don't you call her, since you're both white women who suffer from a sense of white fragility, to talk to each other, because I'm not going to hurt you. I'm going to talk to you about how competent are you in doing their job. And so my concern is we shouldn't have these positions or organizations that purport to serve our community to deal with racial discrimination, racism, anti-racism, things like that, and they're just sitting in their offices all day playing card games on their computer. Again, I can argue, if you look at their outcomes, what can we show that they've done much for us and helped us out? The other issue that I raised related to this conversation, it reminds me of years ago when I was on the Charles Drew board of directors. And again, I used to be a backbencher where I sat on the board and challenged the incompetent behavior. And by the way, I think Charles Drew got some major money from Creighton University because they were getting ready to go under because they had a sense of financial malfeasance. And again, they needed to borrow money from Creighton. And being on this board, I met a number of professionals, including the chief financial officer, who was Fred Solinger. I don't know where he's at today, but he gave me some advice one day about medical doctors, and I never thought of this in that way. He says, Aljamal, when we hire a medical doctor to work for our institution, they should generate 2 to 3 times of their income in patient care. And I'm like, wow, that's a deep barometer, a deep matrix on how you do that. And basically what he was telling me in so many words, that I need to do that as to look at those indicators that they're being effective. And again, fast forward, I think maybe a year later, I had a conversation with Dr. Chuba. He was a longtime physician resident in our community, originally from Nigeria. And he was like the chief medical officer at one time. And as a board chair, I asked him point blank, and I don't think it was a private conversation, that's when I mentioned it now. He said, Aljamal, some of us, when we graduate from medical school, in some cases, we may want to practice medicine, but sometimes we want to be administrative work. So we may not want to see that many patients. So in this case, if you have administrative work, you cannot generate the revenue in terms of those same numbers that Fred talked about. But at the end of the day, when I look at the matrix and the numbers, they have not been as effective as they could be. And that's one of the reasons why I raised this issue, is that different organizations, different entities have different ways of bringing people into their system, and they measure that. And we need to talk about that related to these so-called nonprofits, and as well as organizations like the Nebraska Equal Opportunity Commission and the Equal Opportunity Commission, Human Relations Department, and so on. The other issue that I raised in this conversation is we have what we call recently the abolitionist movement. And for some of you who don't know about that, when George Floyd was murdered by those police officers, again, tortured and murdered and suffocated to death, again, under this current administration, they would not have seen one day in prison or jail. I'm surprised, and maybe at some point they might exonerate them and get them out. But my point is, when that happened, you had justice a little bit, but the point I'm really driving home more than anything, the system can turn on itself where you don't deal with that. But the abolitionist movement got some police departments and organizations to be more accountable to the community. As I've said before on this program, we've had over 50 African Americans or people of color murdered in Nebraska history, and particularly Omaha, and not one police officer spent a day in jail. Again, I'm not saying we got to abolish all the police officers, but sometimes the way you get the intelligence of people who have somewhat similar comatose mentality or a cranial capacity limitation, you have to go to the extreme to make the point. But how is it that we don't have a public safety auditor in our community, and we don't have a lot of people who can have oversight when there's a level of police brutality and other kind of issues that have happened in our community repeatedly? And I remember a person who's late now, Danny Sharpshire and Herbert Sharpshire Herbert told me the story. Somebody I grew up like a cousin said that Danny had run away from a police officer in a vehicle, and they caught him and beat the holy snot out of him. And then I met a couple of people where they actually did some other nefarious things to them. And again, there was no redress because we have rubber stamp commissions and boards and so on. And again, the trauma builds up in the community, just like the 450 years of lynching and Jim Crow for many African Americans. And these are things we need to talk about. Related to this is board leadership and organization. You have people, and I'm using example, the Omaha, the Equal Opportunity Commission board, and I look at their board, and I'm like, who's on leadership? A guy named John Arnold, chairperson. I mean, he looks like he's never set foot in North or South Omaha. He looks like he's running for some office, but not the office of being in charge of that. You got Pat Borcher. I know him. He used to be former law dean over at Creighton University. Nice guy on the board of Catholic Charities, but I've never seen Pat in my life, and I'm 70 years old, outside of a meeting at both either St. Martin's or at Catholic Charities. But again, Pat's a guy. I'm not impinging on his credibility as a person. He might be retired and also may be retired on the commission. But when have you seen or heard them speak about truth to power or justice as commissioners? They got another woman. These three are white folks I'm talking about. Lynn Brennan. She looked like somebody who's a nice person, but again, never heard her speak, seen one articles. And as I said to people, if you want to see how effective people in our community, just do a Google on them or go through some kind of archive or comic books and see if they have anything that they've done. And then they got a guy named Eric Dumb Hiller. Oh, wow. And again, he looks like, so you got 4 white folks. Again, I'm not against white folks because some of my best friends are white folks, as we would say. And they got 2 dark-skinned people, Royce Jeffries, and then a Talisha Komite. I'm not sure the last name. Komite looks like some kind of a Slavic name, so I'm not sure how she got her last name. But again, we as Africans have some unusual names who were imported, or let's say who were dragged, enslaved, and brought to this country. But I've never seen any of these people. They look like nice people, but again, never heard from them, never seen them in North Omaha. And again, I'm going to raise the question, should we have organizations and individuals who are basically called double agents, are people who should be in the victim witness protection program because they're afraid to speak to justice. I also look at the leadership in the Nebraska Arbitration Commission. There's not a black face in store. They haven't had a black male working in that department for years. And again, how can they provide salvation to our community if they don't have the audacity or the wherewithal to let a black man or a black woman or somebody with cranial capacity that expands beyond a P to talk about it? I'm not trying to insult people because I do know there are people who have limited cognitive functions. Again, they can't help themselves, but don't pass yourself as an imposter that you can help us in the community. Again, one of the things we got to talk about is, should we talk about abolitionists? Can I talk about that without offending people? I've known Tommy Warren, Chief Tommy Warren, as a police officer. I know he had a lot to do with getting rid of the public safety auditor. We grew up together. He's a good guy, no impingement on his personality. But I've never seen one piece of paper from Tommy Warren when he's either the executive director of the Urban League talking about anti-racism or race issue. When he's a police chief, Tommy's a nice guy. He'll talk to you. But again, when you put black folks in high places and they don't deliver, why do we need to have people? As Senator Ernie Chambers once says, what's the use of having a gun with no bullets, okay? And so I'm concerned about how we as a people need to deal with our own selves and help us to go forward. I'm going to talk for a few more minutes and I'm going to open it up because, again, I'm talking fast and I need to slow down. One of the things that we have to talk about is, should we have watchdogs or toothless bulldogs? Would you consider, what is the optimum ENEOC or the Human Relations Department? Do they have advisory committees? Do they do community forums? Can we have this conversation? Do they want to shoot the messenger, sometimes literally and figuratively, when they raise some tough questions? Again, knowledge does not bend to ignorance. And again, the question I would say, are these people disabled? Do they have some other problems that we need to be addressing? Because it's obvious some of them don't know how to talk back or deal with issues when someone asks them questions. Again, as I said about Keith Station, I think he's a nice guy. I've met him a few times in different meetings, but like I say, I've never seen a piece of paper from his office, even though I've asked for it more than once. And by the way, the time that he did call me up, and I think it was only once in his life, is when I sent a copy of the letter to all 4 of his 5 white colleagues who were females. Then he called me up. He ended the call abruptly because he had to go take care of one of his children. I'm not sure which one it was, but he had to get off the phone, but he never called me back after that. And that was probably at least a year or two ago, at least. The other thing I want to say is that if we look at the collective situation of us as African Americans, have we done better? And I'll raise 3 quick points to make the point. There are some people who question the legacy of President Obama. When he was in office, what collectively did we benefit from him being in office financially, in terms of did the crime rate go down? Did the reduction of African Americans in prison go down, in jails and in county institutions? Again, those are data numbers that we can look at on the internet. And again, looking at some of the demographic information, I think oftentimes it got worse. If you look in terms of home ownership, we look in terms of income disparities, income increase of African Americans, what can we show differently that we've narrowed the gaps between the dominant group whites who've been here for almost 400, 500 years, getting all this homestead land in Nebraska and elsewhere, and free affirmative actions for white folks, and black folks didn't get that. Again, I'm not going to speak necessarily the other community of color, but I think we're going to have to get them to notch their game up and do some of this work themselves, because I don't hear a lot from the Latinos in the Midlands and other organizations who are speaking out to these important issues that affect our communities respectively, because some of them have suffered from the same degradation and negativity and oppression that exists in our system. In actual fact, it's become normalized that they arrest people, and then the police officer who suffer from some serious trauma or some issues of want to inflict pain on black folks, they beat them up, tase them, and do stuff that they have no business, even when their cameras are running. And I do remember participating in the 360 meeting. I sat in those meetings for a year and a half, and they basically was a waste of my time. As you can talk to the police chief, I oftentimes raise good questions to him, but there was no feedback. There was no letter. And I tell people, I've written to the chief of police in Omaha 5 times. I have no response or no letters, even the 2 or 3 letters where I complimented him on doing some good work. One of the things that happened when an African-American, I guess, killed a police officer, he made it be known that he will not tolerate any of his racist, he didn't use the word racist, but he said white police, he didn't say white either. He said police officers are beating up black folks, because back in the day when, was it Jimmy Wilson got killed and all that stuff, they used used to go up and down and beat black people every day, and there was no way to complain to anyone because we didn't have a public safety auditor. But he did come out and say that, and I got to commend him on that. He did something else that was commendable during his tenure that I commended him on. Again, no feedback. And one time I wrote him a letter asking him to have a meeting in the community with grassroots folks, and that did not happen. In actual fact, to my knowledge, I don't think he's ever had a meeting in North or South Omaha with a group of leadership that he didn't have his Willie Barney entourage with him or the people planted in the audience. Now, again, if I'm lying, challenge me on that, Chief. And I do remember one time we had a meeting together. We were going to set up a meeting downtown. I'd never been to the police department building. I went down there and meet him, and I guess he must have ran out the back door. And Ken Kanger, who was the deputy chief, came up and gave me a tour of the building and talked to me and said the meeting had the chief had an important meeting. But again, I've never met him in his building, nor have he ever done that I'm aware of a community forum with North Omaha like some of the previous chiefs have done. And I do remember Chief Skinner came out one time. It was a heavy duty meeting. He had a packed house at St. Martin Deport Center. And what was unnerving to me is that there was a World Herald reporter in that room, and the World Herald reporter did not write one article or story, even though there were some very strong comments made that was newsworthy. But again, you got to remember the World Herald is part of the status quo, and they cover what they want to cover. And we sometimes, African Americans and people of color, need to talk about how we need to have our own voices in media speak to our agenda. We have to be careful, and we have to be conscious that are we disruptors in the conversation to do disrupt them. And again, I try my best to be very respectful to older people or people who have a little age on them or who are physically or mentally or socially handicapped, that I don't like to get into nefarious arguments or just dubious, like eating licorice, which I am allergic to, both black and red, but I break out or I don't do well with licorice. And so I try not to eat licorice, nor do I try to engage people who are really not serious about our struggle. And what happened too often is we put people in positions who have no business doing that. Again, when I worked at Douglas County, I remember my supervisor at the time, Kim Havakati, used the word qualified black at least 4 or 5 times to me when she wanted to hire somebody who was in a key position. And subsequently, they hired somebody, I think, who had a degree in mentoring or something. But as far as I know, these carpetbaggers and people, they remind me of Cape Town colors from South Africa that have never set foot in the struggle or in North Omaha dealing with some of the issues that you and I are talking about today. So you sit here and you whine and complain about situations when at the end of the day, we can't even hold ourselves and our community accountable and make sure these institutions that are making millions of dollars off our plight and our problem are addressing no problem. It doesn't happen in our community. And again, you have a lot of money being spent, and they use our data, the negativity of our data and who we are, and they hire all their friends of the system. Again, no sense of public policy engagement, and I question and challenge organizations that say they do public policy, but they don't have the representation of our state of population, which is roughly 20% people of color. Again, if we're fair and equitable in Omaha, we would have almost 33% of the people of color or the boards, the staff, and spread throughout that hierarchy. But in actual fact, it's like years ago, I used to go to the medical center as a young lad or even as a kid. I remember all the people of color were working in the basement back then, the old system, and they were all janitors, but I saw very few physicians or people of color in key positions at the medical center. Again, my point is, look at the numbers and look who you got running those so-called human resources and diversity program. Last 2 points I want to make, and I think is very important, is that how many times have many of these entities been into North Omaha? In other words, like I've said before, some of these teachers and educators who fly in on their BMWs, the Lexus, the Volvos, the Lamborghinis, something like that. I'm kind of exaggerating. But how many times have you seen them at a community meeting engaging with our people? And by the way, Cinco de Mayo in South Omaha doesn't count. That's a parade, an event that people do for celebration. Nor does Juneteenth count. Those are like social events that are used to make people more money. But again, they're important events for some people, but not all of us know how to march down the street. And some of us have tight shoes that hurt our feet, so we can't walk down the street, and particularly 24th Street, and then walk back and be part of the old school drill team like some of the people out in Black Studies. Again, no shade on them, but at the end of the day, what can they point to show that they have educated our kids that have been involved in their struggle, particularly when their creation came from our community and people are saying we need to have black faces or people of color, of dark-skinned faces in high places, and what we get is the same old subterfuge and the same old riffraff that we've gotten in Omaha. Last point, and I think it's the most important. When you go to a restaurant, oftentimes they have an evaluation at the table. I was in Houston, Texas one day, one of those nice little restaurants, kind of a chain one, I think. It wasn't a chain game, but it was a restaurant. And at the table, they had an evaluation form. And I remember the young biracial waitress coming up to me. I assume she was biracial because she, didn't have that melanin in my skin that I have. She didn't look like she was Sudan, but she looked like a biracial person. And she was the nicest person and just was very helpful. And I told her what a good person she did. She brought me out some extra this and that. And I was eating with my sister at this restaurant. And by the way, my sister had me pay for that lunch, even though I was visited her. And I kind of like resent that because she had more money than me. But anyway, my point is, the person was very nice, and I filled out this evaluation. I said she did a great job. She provided great service. She's a great ambassador. Bam, bam, bam. Now I don't know if they're going to give her an increase, but they will note that and say, this guy, whoever this customer was, he liked that person. How many times have we had meetings and organizational forums where we have not had evaluations? And we don't get a chance to evaluate the quality and outcome of our institutions. OPS is a good example. They have a research department that is headed by Scott Smithsborn, who runs away whenever I call him. He doesn't answer phone calls. He doesn't respond to correspondence. And then when I did ask for information one time from him, he said basically I had to fill like a 2 or 3 page paper form. I felt I was applying for a dissertation question or something. But again, they make it so difficult, and so they obfuscate the situation so bad that we can't even get basic data on racial makeup of the kids in terms of achievement. Oh yes, we got more graduating, but again, if you look at their graduation and their matriculation into, let's say, matriculation into college or university, what are the numbers there? What are we showing out there? So those are the kind of things we need to ask. But basically, we're talking about Nebraska Equal Opportunity Commission and Human Relations Department. Should that be abolished? Now, again, the jury is not made a statement yet, but based on my experience and what they say, I would even question why we're wasting our time with them. And again, one of the things I want to say to you is that we can say the same thing for a lot of our organizations. Again, if I'm a track star and I can only run the 100-yard dash in maybe 2 minutes, what kind of track star am I? I'm a marathon runner, and the average marathon may be, 5 minutes or 10 minutes, whatever the number is. I'm throwing it out there. And it takes me 2 days. How good am I? I remember when I was in the military as a young lad, I was in the military, just the basic training and not OT, but the Army Reserve. And they made us do a 25-mile walk. I was like blown away by the stuff we went through. And I came back out of that experience. I was only in the military just for the summertime for a little bit, this and that. But the thing that I'm saying to the audience is that when you finish, you have to finish the 25-mile walk and you've accomplished it. When you go into those they have those tear gas buildings that you go into. They make you take your mask off and you have to smell tear gas. So I know what tear gas smells like. And so what I'm trying to say is that there are some of us who have a bird nest on the ground. We never busted a grape. And at the end of the day, we walk around all excited and happy for symbolism, when in actual fact, these organizations should be talking about abolitionists. If it doesn't serve our purpose, get rid of it. If the mechanic can't fix the car, go to a different mechanic, or basically that mechanic can't do their job. And the same thing with someone who is a plumber. We should hold the same level of accountability when that plumber walks out of my house and he charged me $300 or whatever he charged me, he or she. I want to make sure that my drains are unstopped. And again, only in the case of education and in terms of Equal Opportunity Commission office, Human Relations Department, they have very little to show for their substance. And again, you're not going to have substance show for your substance if people don't come to work on time. They despise the very people they're supposed to serve. And I'm not going to call nobody's name out, but one of the directors told me of the Nebraska Equal Opportunity Commission office that she had to fight her white staff over trying to enforce some basic rules and issues because they didn't want to push back. And go back to the case of Senator Tony and Senator Terrell McKinney, they introduced legislation that deal with disproportionate impact or desperate impact on people of color in the state of Nebraska. There are many state workers who pushed against that legislation, according to, at that time, Senator Tony, because they didn't want to be held accountable. So you wonder why state government in Nebraska looks all white. You wonder why the governor or the previous governor made a statement that to the senior staff, they should not use the word race and talk about diversity and so on. Again, he told it to a white worker who told it to another white worker who told it to me. And that white worker said to me, I want you to hypothetically know this conversation is about me talking to you hypothetically. Now, again, hypothetically, who are you to come with a hypothetical when you know it's reality? mentality when you should be mature and old enough to be able to say what truth is. So at that point, I think we need to talk to ourselves as a community. Are we going to hold our systems accountable? Are we going to go to okey doke and do the same kind of crap trap that's been going on? And at the same time, I don't want to pay taxes, property tax, or any kind of taxes to a city government or county government or school district that will not hire discerning African American men and women and family centered people who know how to help protect our families instead of some of the stuff that we got going on today. So at this point, I'd like to stop, give people a chance to raise questions, comments. And again, as I like to say to folks, we do have freedom of speech. We had a show about a week or so ago, and I noted that there was probably about 12 people on the show, and only 2 or 3 commented, "Oh, what's wrong? Are we living in communist Russia? Are we living in Iraq, Iran, where we're scared of freedom of speech? What are we at?" Again, I'm want to just throw it out to be facetious, but again, we should be able to deal with that. So at this point, I'm going to stop and let people raise their concerns and issues and challenge me if they disagree with me. But at the end of the day, can we prove that these entities, particularly the Nebraska Monitoring Commission and the Omaha Human Rights and Relations Department, is worth its salt? And by the way, for the record, when Franklin Thompson got the job years ago, Dr. Thompson, you working at a university, I wrote a letter to the mayor and all the city council members. I said, you need to look at considering whether the department is effective. No response from none of the city council members, nor from, I know Franklin, sorry, I didn't write to him, but I did write to the mayor and all the other city council members. That letter is sitting somewhere in the dustbin, but I do have copies of my correspondence for over 35 years that I've been sending to public functionaries and opportunists and people who have not addressed many of the issues that we see today. As Paul Fowlman once said, if we want to look at our conditions and what it's about, use reverse engineering. Something is wrong when we look at all the negativities that occur in our community and people say they're doing a good job, like the Empowerment Network and the state of Omaha that obviously been practicing their dance routine for many years. So let me stop there, give folks a chance to breathe, push back, and share their concern. The only thing I want to be careful on is I want to get as many different people to share their observations and concerns about the question at hand. So questions, go forward. I can't hear you. Can I hear you? Is something on my mic? Is my system mic mute? Was it mute? Somebody put me on mute. Mute. I can't say the word today. Muted. Muted is the word. So anyone, by the way, anyone, I mean, I hope there's a brave soul in our state and our city who's watching this. And by the way, we are Facebook Live. So, again, if you don't want to share your name or save something, you can type out something and we can kind of keep you anonymous. Okay.
Hey, Ajmal, it's Karen. And I just wanted folks to know that there are annual reports for the Nebraska EOC, and I did just do a quick glance at it, and you can see that the vast majority of requests for assistance are coming from Douglas County. That's not a big surprise, but it's kind of interesting to take a quick look at that. And I put the link into the chat in case anybody's interested. But so you can find out for 2023 the total, let's see, amount of, let's see, what is it? The, average processing time for each case, how much relief is obtained, monetary relief is obtained in this report. So it's kind of interesting. And I'm curious if anybody who's on this call has ever taken a look at this and thought about, the fact they really don't see that many cases every year or deal with that many cases every year that I can, based on my just very cursory analysis.
Well, I'm not going to call them lazy, but I think the issue I'm going to say is that over the years, they have not notched up their game. And again, that's one of my concerns. But the question I think, Karen, you raised is that how do we measure the value of them? And do we value them in Nebraska to say this is good, bad, or indifference? And what is their comparison to other states? Again, it's Nebraska Equal Opportunity Commission, but they're controlled by a commission, a board of basically people who don't have anti-racism training or expertise or even diversity skill set. And then they got two undisclosed black folks who I don't know anything about them, and I don't have to know them. I mean, I've been around for a while, and again, they might be well known, they might be good athletes, or I don't know, you know. But again, my point is, how do they measure up, and have any of them ever made contact with the vast majority of African Americans who live in Omaha or even out in outstate Nebraska? And I do know that we had a DEA director for the university, and I met him probably when they were ready to eliminate his job. But I wrote him about 3 or 4 times, and only when they were ready to eliminate his job, then he reached out to me. And when I found out his main agenda wasn't race, it was sexual orientation. Again, I'm not mad at him, but when you bring a black man from Utah with a PhD, he's a nice guy, but he told me out of his own mouth, I think I was sitting in the room with Terry Crawford, he said he only been to Omaha maybe twice during his whole tenure and talked to maybe, I think I'm exaggerating, one time I talked to Willie Barney and his tribe, but no sense of connectionness with our community. Again, my point is, how can you be the head of diversity for the Nebraska university system and don't have a relationship with black folks in the city of the state? Same thing with UNO. So again, all is Karen is related, but I don't know the answer to these questions. But how long did it take the Nebraska Opportunity Commission to put that data on their webpage? Is there someone who can talk about that?
Follow up to Karen's report that she posted in the chat. I think what's telling more so than anything in this report is on page 12. And on page 12 of the report, it describes how many cases they've received, for example, in the year 23-24. So if you look at page 12, it looks like they've received about 582 cases in the year 23-24. Out of those 582 cases, they've only found reasonable cause in 9.
No, you're
So
making that up. Wait, hold on. Are you serious?
in 9.
Oh,
So
wow.
that leads me to believe that there's something inherently wrong with the process, whether it's procedurally or whether it's substantively. But if you're saying there's about 582 cases coming in that door and only 9, there's reasonable cause that's been founded, I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed.
By the way, post a quick question for you, and I know that you went to Lincoln to one of their board meetings and you had a chance to interact with their staff, the director, and you saw them firsthand. 2 questions here. One, you went to Lincoln because of what, in terms of, and I think it has something to do with their posting of their data, which was backlog. And then number two, from that meeting, did you see that there was a certain level of higher cognitive process about this basic question you just got through answering?
Right. So the main issue was there was a lot of things that I saw that were missing in terms of how they process these cases. And the reason why that is important is that procedurally, there's certain rules you have to follow. And if you don't follow these rules procedurally, it could impact your case substantively. So for example, let's say there's a certain statute of limitation that you have to comply with. You could have the best case in the world, or the case that is just where discrimination is just blatant on its face. But if you don't comply within that statute of limitations, your claim can be obviously dismissed. So there was some issues with some of the information that was being passed on to some of these individuals who didn't have lawyers. And sometimes when they would come to me, their case would be compromised to a point where I could not help them. So that's what prompted my me going to Lincoln and me trying to figure out what was going on with the commission. And since then, I mean, I've had subsequent cases, and there's issues that I'm seeing that are happening procedurally. And again, I know some people may not understand how important that is. And as an example, if I'm filing a claim for discrimination and I am presenting that claim to the NEOC, and then they present that allegation to the other side, but they allow that the other side to have, let's say, 6 months to answer that claim, or that charge. That's prejudicial to the person filing the complaint. And the reason why that's prejudicial is, imagine, for example, they get to do a take-home test while you get to do a pop quiz. Obviously, it's more difficult for the complainant to win if those are the terms of the case.
The other question that I raise in terms of the statute of limitation as related to that, who watches them? In other words, I think in a conversation somewhere, they have a board of directors or commission. Do they seem like they were able to be watchdogs or guardian of the public interest dealing with race, and particularly with some of them who are anonymous personalities that we've never seen or heard in our communities of color, or people dealing with anti-racism? So what was your observations when you went to the meeting? I assume they held it in the state office building somewhere.
Yeah, so the board of directors has little to no input on the substantive day-to-day of the commission. From what I was there and witnessing, it was just more policy type conversations that were going on. The executive director gave her report about what was going on within that month. And, that was pretty much it. The meeting subsequently probably would have lasted maybe, let's say, 30 minutes or so. And then obviously they get into administrative stuff, which is, there's really nothing there. So, I mean, there's really not much substance going on at those board meetings.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Other feedback, other reactions to the conversation. By the way, I remember when Franklin Thompson was the director of the Human Relations Department, he had a number of rap contests and kind of events that were unrelated to getting relief from city and county government or city government people to do stuff to help out. I do know they had a compliance officer deal with contracts. It was a white guy I think I met this guy at the Tri-Faith conference a few years ago, and he told me that they were not in compliance with some things. Again, I don't think he was talking out of school, maybe he was. And I called him and he never called me back. And then subsequently I called again recently around December sometime, and it was like about a week ago, he sent me what they call electronic version of their record. But again, it took me almost 3 months to get this from him, and his apology was, I lost the phone call. But again, I'm the guy who's called more than once and sent more than one letter, and this is the kind of behavior that I've gotten from city and county employees, where they act like they're not accountable to the public. And again, if I'm going to pay taxes, let me get my return on the taxes. But other feedback, other questions.
So I was just going to add that it looks like if you look at the basis for charges filed, and they're generally in the categories of employment or housing / public accommodation, a total of 345 cases were filed on the basis of race, and an additional 72 on the basis of color. But if you look at those that were found to have reasonable cause, only 3 of the race-based cases were found to have reasonable cause. So maybe you can correct me if I'm misinterpreting that. But that looks like it to me. Out of 345 race cases, only 3 were found to have reasonable cause.
Yeah. Pretty low, right? Pretty low. And my argument is, if the statistics don't make sense, I think we need to look a little bit deeper to see why do you have a 0.00001% chance in a reasonable cause finding? And if that's the case, you should let these individuals know who are relying on this system or relying on the NEOC for redress that the chances of that happening is so slim. You might as well go to the gas station and play the scratch game, and you might win there the redress that you need.
The other thing related to this, and again, I think I'm going to switch back to human relations on this question, is years ago, I used to be on the board of Family Housing Advisory Board, and I think Teresa Hunter was the executive director. I think she still is. And they used to talk about, they used to go out and do test cases. And they said when they found someone was guilty of housing discrimination, they had no meat or no substance or teeth to force them to do something differently. And so these real estate agencies would continue to steer people in certain parts of town based on their race. So basically, it goes out to redlining, which has happened in Omaha and Lincoln throughout this country. But Teresa Hunter, to my knowledge, has never proposed strengthening let's say Teresa as executive director of the board, strengthening the laws that have some teeth to it, like maybe in other states. Because again, it's one thing to go out and catch somebody who's guilty of a crime, or you may call it a sin or social sin, whatever. And all you do is say, well, we warn you, and they go back and do it again, like Wells Fargo, who got caught stealing money or charging black and brown communities inordinate amount of interest rates as contrast to white ones. So my point is, if you got people who are working in positions, human relations department and this, who don't seem to redeem themselves or even help push public policy legislation to give them more teeth, then we get at the conversation I am today, or the conversation we collectively are. Why do we have these bogus organizations existing when they're not doing their job? And particularly, it's obvious that people are incompetent. Again, I'm not mad at them. They may be good at something, because everybody's good at something. But again, looking at what they're supposed to do and mandated, they're not doing it. I'm not sure if the governor gave them marching orders and they can't talk about race to do their jobs. It's scary.
I'm wondering, also looking at this data, it says that on the in terms of monetary relief that folks are getting as a result of this is on page 17. In terms of monetary relief, 0 is coming as a result of litigation as opposed to mediation or settlement. And I'm just curious, does anybody know why they're not litigating any of these cases?
Because they don't know how.
Oh gosh, that's not the answer that I wanted, but
Well,
it explains
I mean,
a lot.
and just frankly, if you're bringing in, there's about 582 cases coming in a year. And again, I understand that they're supposed to be neutral and unbiased in terms of how they process the case. But remember, there's a charge that they're supposed to stamp out discrimination either in the workplace or in housing. And if there is probable cause, they have the authority to jump in on the case and litigate that case. But if and I don't know if this has ever happened, I can't recall there being a case where the NAOC has successfully litigated that case either in state court or in federal court. And remember, they have the ability to jump in on a case if there is a reasonable cause finding. And if I see 000 under cases that are litigated in court, that shows me that they don't really do that in terms of, that responsibility that they're charged with. They're not properly effectuating that.
Mm-hmm.
That reminds me of years ago, Glenn Freeman, a friend of mine, was on the Human Rights and Relations Board. And again, I guess they might have called it a board, not the board in the sense, but they have decide some of the cases they pursue. And he said there was a case of an older woman who had had some discrimination. I think it was at the crossroads or someplace, or something that happened that was very nefarious, or was very obvious. And he said the board voted against that woman. And when they did that, he got walked out and quit the board. And I was like, wow, is it that deep? You guys are supposed to be people of color and you're supposed to be representing our community. And Glenn Freeman, by the way, does not support busing. He doesn't support affirmative action, but he does support justice. And he said it was a case where even a blind person could have seen the results was obviously what this woman went through. And it was almost like the people at the time, I don't know any of them because I don't think he mentioned their names to me. It was almost like they were in the pocket or they were paid off or there was corruption going on, because he said it was too blatant what that older lady went through as a black older woman. And the same thing with police brutality. You see the camera in front of you, and there are still people this day that think that George Floyd should have died unjustly, being choked to death by that police officer and his comrades. So those are the kind of points we're talking about. At what point will we, as good people, people of color, people with the oppressed, or at the bottom, wherever, speak out to these systems that constantly abdicate or do the kind of things they do to keep us in lockjaw and in these second-class positions? One other point I'll throw out to the both of y'all, if you, in your experience and so on, have you ever seen a community forum an issue, and I know both of y'all have been in the community for a while in different places, where you've seen these officers go out and talk to people. In other words, I know part of this will do some education, but have you seen them do outreach? The last time I saw them was the time I did about 20 years of Catholic Charities. By the way, the director at that time was African American, and he took my sign-up sheet and took credit for the meeting like he set it up, even though I did. But I remember that meeting very well because it was almost comical. Remember Vicky Parks chewing out one of the Latino persons about sitting on the sidelines. But he took the signing sheet and took credit with his board that he set it up. And even though I did all the legwork at our main office. But my question back to you is, have you seen any of them ever in the community do a community forum from the Human Rights Department or the Nebraska Equal Opportunity Commission office?
Not me. I've seen other agencies. I'm thinking Foster Care Review Office. I've seen them do presentations. I've seen ACLU do presentations. That's a couple that just come off the top of my head in terms of being out there in the public sphere.
And the other thing I raised with that is you got staff members, directors of people in leadership who purport to be serving all of Nebraska or all of Omaha or Douglas County or whatever, and they've never set foot in many of these communities that have the highest demographics in terms of who they should be serving. Again, I couldn't make this up, and all you got to do is look at their mileage sheet or their fake mileage sheet to know that they didn't do that. And so I do know that Douglas County is holding some kind of a meeting coming up, but again, it's going to be the same old usual suspects because there's no social capital or person and staff who can reach out to communities of color or those who have a disproportionate number of kids or young people in the DCYC or the juvenile justice system. I do know that, as I said before, they don't really have an advisory committee out at the DCYC. And again, you got that kiddie jail downtown near 16th and Douglas in that area. It sits empty. They're spending what, $200,000-$300,000 a month, and there's nobody in there. And they again thought that they would reduce the numbers by doing some magic Rubik cube stuff, and it didn't happen. One other point that I want to share, and I think it's a question that I can ask. Oftentimes, we hear people who work in higher education, who work in law school, or who are teachers, professors, so on. Have you ever seen any of these folks in our community addressing these very issues of this? In other words, Poster, you alluded to there's not people who can litigate or do this. Karen, you alluded to you've seen a couple of agents out there, but have you seen people from our law schools or in those positions do community forums or lawyers engage in our communities wherever you live at or where you're at? Can you recall one person who has an attorney degree or practicing law who's done a community forum in your lifetime in North or South Omaha? I can count maybe 3 or 4 that I know, but again, we're talking almost 20 years ago. And then I do remember a couple of them. I'm talking about practicing attorneys who've done a community forum engaging, particularly in the African American and Latino community. I know these large attorneys, but I don't know.
I've been to one event on the Creighton campus.
But never in North and South
Creighton
Omaha.
Creighton Law School campus.
Okay. And by the way, let me backtrack. I did invite the ombudsman for child welfare, who has a law degree. I invited the state ombudsman, I think, who has a law degree. I'm not sure, maybe not. And then, of course, the third person was corrections. I know he doesn't have a law degree, but they came to North Omaha twice, and I think we did through Moore's Karen a virtual thing for them. But after that, we never heard from them again after we wrote letters about developing an advisory committee. So my question again I raise is that if some of these intelligentes or highly educated people don't set foot in the community of these very communities they supposedly serve, how can we grow and improve and deal with the demographics you just talked about?
Yeah, I didn't include them because if we invited them and they wouldn't have spoken to the public otherwise, that doesn't count.
Yeah, you're right. Again, it took a while to get them to come out, and we took a while to get the Trinity out, or the 3 individuals. But like I say, I've never heard a word from them. I see a report that comes across my desk, but there's nobody deconstructing those reports for our community, or even have a town hall say, "Hey, this is what's going on. We need your support." The same with public policy agencies. I question sometimes their validity in our community.
I'm also looking on page 22 of their last report at the actual amount of money, whether lump sum dollars or in wages, that they're getting supposedly for people who've had successful cause of findings. And unfortunately, what they've done is they've combined race and sex, which are not the same thing. into one category and say that, in 2023, 24, between those two categories, which is really a combination of something like 600 cases that came down the pike, there was a lump sum of $60,000 total and $12,000 total in wages.
Pretty small, right?
Yeah, very
Yeah,
small.
extremely small. So that's another issue that you can see is that, you've got maybe, let's say we're funneling it down 582 complaints, maybe nine individuals that they find there's probable cause or whatnot, and then now we've got
It was three.
award
It was three.
three, and now you've
Yeah.
got an award of 60,000 over three individuals.
But it's combined with sex discrimination. So
Right.
you have no idea actually how much they're getting for people who have had complaints about racial discrimination because
Right.
they muddied their data.
In statistics, we call it confounding the data, or we call it messing it up. As you said, muddy is a good word. But a lot of organizations do that, whether you want to talk about RED, DMC, Douglas County. The data is not always put out to the community. Sometimes they may throw it on the web page. It takes you 2 years to find it. And the same with the city. I mean, Keith Station is a good example. There's another person, I think Sharif Thomas, who works as a deputy chief police, written her a couple of times about data on the police department, and some of those people, no responses, no feedback, even though they released some of that stuff to the empowerment network up to a point. But again, that's a question. So one of the things that this question is begging to me, and again, I think it's one of the reasons why we had this program, this show, is that we may need to have a state senator introduce an interim resolution or even expand on this conversation. Should we eliminate the human relations? Or no, maybe let's narrow it down. Well, let's go with the Nebraska Equal Opportunity Commission. That's what you're focused on more today. But we do want to get their sidekick in the area related to the city of Omaha. But should we actually talk about getting rid of the department, looking at the dismal output that we see from the data that they produce, and it took them years to produce that data in a public form that we can sometimes look at it externally? So is that a legitimate question that we can ask? Or am I being too presumptuous or negative or browbeating these front organizations that are basically subterfuges that are apologists for racism and sexism and the things that go on? Right now, just based on what you said today, I want to eliminate the department. And we have no need to waste our time. Just get rid of them, find them another job, doing something like, pulling out paper clips or something else elsewhere, but it's obvious they're not doing their job. And nowhere else would you tolerate in a private corporation who's seeking a certain kind of monetary relief, people working for a whole year and this is all they produce. Are you serious? And the board of directors or the commission members, they're just taking per diem just for driving to Lincoln and just having kibbles and bits or their Panera bread sandwiches, but they shouldn't be on the commission. It's obvious. And again, what's even more egregious and negative, one of the persons is a former dean of the law school at Creighton. How does that work out? I mean, are you serious? Don't misunderstand me. He's a good guy. He's a nice guy. You can invite him over for dinner. But it's obvious looking at this data, somebody's sleeping at the wheel.
I guess, I have very mixed feelings about this because I feel like, the destruction of government offices is happening at a, very vast and unacceptable level at the federal level right now. And so while I understand your point, there's a part of me that is like, oh no, really does everything have to be compared to the private sector? I don't know. I wish I knew more about whether change is possible. And I just don't know. I mean, I want there to be government entities that are there for the protection of, workers. And so if they're not there, they're not there. And then what? So to me, it's complicated and I don't have the answer. I just wish there was a way to improve the government office rather than destroy it.
So, Karen, I know you know about the nonprofit complex. It's not all about it. It's not about this situation when we're making money and we using these child welfare organizations as cottage industry to make money for people who don't serve the people. So do you believe in the industrial nonprofit complex exists?
Well, it's a little bit apples and oranges because the NEOC is a government office, not a nonprofit. So,
Okay.
but I think I made myself clear that I don't know the answer, but the idea of I would rather see some kind of an attempt to make an office that works, but um,
So one of the questions came up. One of the questions came up, Karen, is can we organize all the workers, or are there any groups in Omaha that exist that can help push this agenda to make it more accountable? I'm going to argue for an interim report to find out if it's worth the squeeze, if it's worth our time. And one of the issues I think that's very important is that, yes, there's a sense of cognitive dissonance. We don't want to get rid of maybe affirmative action office, but if they're not doing their job, why have them there? It's almost like we got a rifle on display that was made in 1838 and there's no bullets made for that rifle, or you got a case of a cannon that you don't have any bullets, but yet you want to go to war and fight Ukraine. You follow me? So my point to us, we wonder why our numbers keep getting worse in these communities of the struggle, or even as women or other groups, and no one is addressing the basic core issues we're talking about today. Let's say very few. Let me backtrack, because there might be somebody in the wilderness that we don't know about who's raising these same questions. They're ignoring them also. And I do know that the people who work for these respective organizations have listened and will be listening to this telecast. And I hope they'll respond accordingly, because as of now, we've raised some very powerful questions about where we as a community, and particularly in the time of Trumpism. Before we get down, we got about 4 minutes left, and I know the YouTube been the main speakers. I had about 10 people sign up for this program, just like last week, and people didn't follow through. I don't know if the FBI and the CIA is buffering them or what, or whatever's going on, but I know some people watching the Facebook Live. But what are some of your closing arguments or issues that you think we should do based upon this brief discussion we've had? And then, by the way, this is one of the first discussions that I'm aware of in the public sphere where we're questioning the legitimacy or existence of these departments. So go ahead.
I just wanted to go back for a second to respond to Nomi. Hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And say that the only organization that I know of that organizes all workers, at least all industrial workers, is the Wobblies, the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW. But they're, most of the time, unions you really focus on specific subpopulations of workers in general. So, but IWW still exists. They were founded in Chicago in 1905.
Okay, got you. Folks, any comments you want to make as we close out?
I think what's important to note is, where is the government putting their money? And what sorts of programs are they putting? Now, the number one thing that the government is going to do when they want something to fail is to defund it, right? And if that's a reason why there's an issue with certain governmental organizations, we need to bring that to light. Now, if that's not the issue, then it becomes who's controlling the narrative. Now, if you have someone who's controlling the narrative who wants something to fail, right, then it is going to fail. But if you have someone controlling the narrative that wants something to succeed, then it has a greater possibility of succeeding. So I think as a take-home point, one of the important things that we need to do is we need to start controlling the narrative from the top to the bottom.
On that note, I'd like to say thank y'all for both participating. The other issue that came to light to me was when I worked at Douglas County, the RED, racial ethnic disparity, and of course the disproportionate minority contact, or coordinator, is that how much when they brought you to the table, they worked diligently to make you not work to be effective. And again, one of the things that I saw is that it was almost like the drag on the airplane as it was landing, where you turn the brakes on when the plane is starting to take off. You're not going to go too fast or far if the brakes are already turned on. many of these organizations, that's their MO. And it's obvious when you ask for data, and we do need more demographic people, the demographers, as they call them, both in the academic community. I don't think there are that many in UNO or Creighton. And I definitely would say I've not seen any of them with racial data. And again, as I said, OPS, they collect some data, but they don't share it with the community because it would show that many of these things that they do are not effective. So I appreciate y'all being on and talking. Again, we throw out some heavy light to people, and maybe it may cause us to pause to say, again, Karen, going back to your point, there's a certain cognitive dissonance we feel as people who want to support entities and organizations to help our respective community and groups. But at the same time, we have to go back to what Ernie said one time when he said, I'd rather have a competent white police officer than an incompetent black police officer. And again, that's cold-blooded the way he said, but what he was saying is that when that Sudanese woman had that officer put his foot on that Sudanese woman's back who was pregnant, he went ballistic. And he says, when I can't get no satisfaction from someone who looks like me, I don't want him in the job. So I'd rather have somebody who I know who's a known racist or incompetent, like we may have currently. I use the word may right today, but again, as a public servant, I can say they're not doing their job based on what I know, and we got to get to talk to that as a community. You can't shoot the messenger, nor can you challenge the people who raise important issues in freedom of speech. But folks, we're up on terrible times now, and we can't have the few doing the work of the many. On that note, I'd like to thank folks for viewing and watching this. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact us. In upcoming months, we may have a couple of guest hosts who will do some programs about issues related to education and so on. And we wanted to spread the love around in our community where people can talk unfettered or talk about issues that are important to all of us that help can change the status quo, because right now we cannot be standing on the sidelines. So on that note, thank you very much. As we always end, may the force be with you. Baroko.